Not again. It was Sophie's only thought as the black cloaked figures grabbed the net, pulling it tighter around them. Keith shouted something she didn't hear as she closed her eyes, waiting to feel the fear and rage swell inside her head, but all she could muster was a shudder. She must be too weak to inflict. A flash of light shot past her, hitting one of the figures and making him collapse in a trembling heap. They have a meddler, another figure shouted as Sylvanie reared in the loosened net. Where did you get that? Sophie yelled as Keith raised the silver weapon and fired another shot. Grady insisted I take it, but he didn't want me to tell you in case it freaked you out. He fired again, but his aim was wrecked by Sylvanie's thrashing. The 4 remaining figures closed off their circle, and one of them reached for a meddler of his own. Don't hit the alicorn, one of the others shouted at him. Isn't this the point where you develop some new impossible ability and get us out of here? Keith yelled, as they ducked a meddler blast aimed at them. I wish. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut and tried to rally her concentration. Nothing's working right now. Even her arms and legs were too weak and slow. All she could do was cling to Sylvanie's neck with what little strength she had, and hope Keith could either take out the attackers or that the Black Swan would send help. Keith aimed at the figure who was armed, but before he fired, one of the figures nailed Keith in the head with a rock. The melder slipped from his hand. Oh, so that's how it is, Keith shouted, whipping one of Sandor's weird throwing stars at him. The silver blades clipped the figure's shoulder, tearing his cloak and making him drop the end of his net. Don't let the alicorn get away, the attacker shouted, flailing to re-grab the ropes. Keith flung another pointed star, but he missed. These things are hard to aim. How many weapons do you have? Sophie asked him. Hopefully enough. Keith tossed a third throwing star, missing again. Try cutting the ropes, Sophie shouted. Before Keith could try, Sylvanie bucked again, rearing back so hard she pulled partially free of the net, enough to spread her wings. A powerful flap had made them airborne, but they'd only moved a few feet off the ground before a black lasso swung around Sylvanie's neck and jerked her down so hard her legs collapsed. Sylvanie's right wing bent backward as she toppled to her side. The majestic horse screeched in pain, and Sophie and Keith tumbled off her back, rolling across the rocky ground until they crashed into the side of the cave. What have you done? One of the figures shouted as the remaining 4 of them rushed for Sylvanie. Sophie struggled to pull free from the tangle of rope, surprised that none of them seemed concerned with capturing her. Before she could decide what that meant, there was a blinding flash of light and the ground shook, cracking around their attackers and sending them sprawling. Through the thick dust, Sophie caught a glimpse of Mr. Forkle and a cluster of dwarves running toward them. Get out of here, Mr. Forkle screamed as the hooded figures advanced on him and the dwarves. Leap Sophie home, Keith. But Sophie wasn't leaving Sylvanie. Keith must have been thinking the same thing because he pulled himself up and jumped over the fissure to where Sylvanie lay thrashing on their side. Come on, Foster, he shouted, holding out his arms to catch her. Sophie pulled herself upright, summoning as much strength as she could as she ran for the opening, jumping at the last possible second. Only 1 foot caught the ground on the other side, but Keith grabbed her arms and dragged her over. He wiped her cheek, and when he pulled his hand away, it was smeared with red. Sophie wasn't surprised. He had a huge gash over his eyebrow. She was sure she was just scraped. Get up, Sylvanie, she transmitted, and the injured alicorn struggled to her feet. Keith lifted Sophie onto Sylvanie's back and crawled on behind her. As soon as his hands locked around her waist, Sophie transmitted, Fly! Sylvanie ran toward the edge of the cliff and leapt off. She flapped her shimmering wings, but the right one was crooked and bleeding, and when the wind hit her feathers, it bent backward, sending them dropping like a stone toward the ocean below. Fly, Sophie screamed, but no matter how hard Sylvanie flapped and flailed, her wing wouldn't work. Now what? Keith shouted. Teleport! Sophie repeated the command over and over, but Sylvanie's mind was too clouded by fear and pain to respond. Teleport now or we're going to die. Sophie? Keith screamed as several precious seconds slipped by. Sylvanie, you have to get us out of here. Help! The terrified horse transmitted. I don't know how. But Sylvanie just kept repeating, help, over and over, and as Sophie imagined them splattering above the rocky shore, something inside her clicked. She wasn't sure if it was instinct or pure desperation, but it felt like her brain switched into autopilot, feeding off her adrenaline to generate warmth and energy, and swirling the two forces together until it felt like an explosion rocketed from her mind. The blast tore an opening in space, and a split second later they crashed through it into the void. The gray space felt different now that Sophie was the one in control, and she realized they could go anywhere, everywhere. All she had to do was think about it and it would be. There was only one place she wanted to go. Before she could fully think the word, the grayness split with a flash of light and they dropped through it, landing in a crumpled heap in the soft grass of Havenfield. Chapter 59. I think I maxed out on adventure for a while, Keith said, as Elwyn flashed a red orb around his chest. Thick scratches covered his arms, and his chin had a gash almost as deep as the one over his eyebrow. Now I know why you need a physician on standby, Foster. Are you really okay? Sophie asked, feeling a bit dizzy every time she looked at the red streaks on his skin. She hoped they didn't hurt as much as the deep cut across her right cheek. Grady and Edeline had rushed outside the second they'd heard Sylvanie's agonizing screeching. They'd helped Keith and Sophie pull themselves away from the thrashing, wounded horse, and they'd hailed Elwyn and sedated Sylvanie before she could hurt herself further. But Sophie and Keith had both insisted on being treated outside in case Sylvanie woke up. Sophie winced as she tried to shift to a more comfortable position on the grassy ground. The instructions Mr. Forkel had sent explicitly forbade elixirs, serums, or sedatives of any kind. All Elwyn had been able to do was wash clean her wounds, which she was not happy about. She wasn't a fan either. It would have been nice to at least use the numbing balm, but they couldn't chance it. I knew I should have gone with you, Sandor grumbled, slashing his sword at the air like he was slaying imaginary attackers. Grady nodded as he paced back and forth across the pasture, wearing a groove in the soft ground. Every few seconds he pummeled them with more questions about what happened, most of which Sophie didn't know the answers to, or didn't want to answer. She didn't know if she'd teleported or how she'd done it if she had, but she didn't want anyone to know either way. Then she'd have to explain about her crazy alicorn-inspired DNA, and everyone would probably run screaming away from the girl who was part horse. Another secret. But something she just couldn't share. I'm so glad you're okay, Grady said, crouching and wrapping his arms around her. The hug was gentle, but tight, too, like he never wanted to let go. Sophie didn't want him to. Thank you for trusting me, she told him. Thank you for coming back. She heard Edeline sniffle and glanced over to where she was busy tending to Sylvanie. When their eyes met, Edeline whispered, I love you. I love you too, Sophie whispered back. I haven't been able to reach your parents, Grady told Keith. I tried hailing your father, but he hasn't responded yet. Yeah, and it's not like you'd expect him to be waiting up all night for me to come home safe or anything. Sophie tried to think of something to say, but Grady changed the subject. I guess this means you were right about the Black Swan, Sophie. I need to let my suspicions go. You really do. She tightened her grip around him as she added, I asked him about Jolie. His back went rigid. You what? He let me ask one question, and I asked about Jolie. He said that was not what the message meant, and that they had nothing to do with the fire. Grady wobbled and leaned back to bury his face in his hands. When he looked up, tears had pooled in his eyes and his arms were shaking. So it wasn't my fault, he whispered. The question made Sophie's heart swell. Now he could let go of his anger and his guilt, all the burdens he'd been carrying and battling for so long. Now he could just be Grady again. Did he know anything about the fire? Grady asked, drying his eyes on his sleeve. Sophie frowned. It almost seemed like he'd never considered it a murder, because he said it explains many things. But when I asked him what that meant, he told me I'd already used up my question. Grady heaved a heavy sigh, and Sophie couldn't blame him. Then he strangled her with another hug. Thank you for asking, Sophie. I'm sure there were lots of other things you wanted to know. There were, she admitted, but that was the most important. And not just for Grady. She may be an anomaly and a freak and created for things she didn't understand, and her real father may or may not be some mysterious elf who kept abandoning her when she needed him most. But she wasn't made by murderers. She wasn't bad. Explain to me more about these attackers, Sandor interrupted. I would like to better understand my enemy. Sophie shivered as the 5 black-cloaked figures filled her mind. There were more of them this time, but I didn't recognize any of their voices. They had a patch on their sleeve, Keith added, as Elwyn flashed more light around his face. A white circle with an eye in the center, like it was staring at you. Totally creepy. Can you project this symbol? Grady asked Sophie, but she shook her head. I didn't see it. I wish I had. I'll try to draw it, Keith offered. I got a good look as I was aiming through those starblade things, and I sliced one of their shoulders pretty deep. Maybe it'll leave a scar we can recognize. Good boy, Sandor told him. Yeah, well, what would have happened if the Black Swan hadn't shown up with their dwarves? Things were getting pretty bleak. I wonder if they really would have taken us, though, Sophie mumbled, almost to herself. I think they were after Sylvanie. She was the only one they shouted at each other about. It was like Keith and I were just grabbed by default. Grady turned pale as he processed that. We better warn the guards to be on high alert. Sandor nodded. I don't understand why they'd want her, Sophie admitted. Power. Grady went back to wearing a groove in the soil with his pacing. Sylvanie is the only one who can reset the timeline. Whoever controls her has the council at their mercy, to some extent, which means I'd better alert them immediately. He pulled out his imparter and moved far enough away they couldn't listen to what he said, which was just as well. Sophie didn't want to hear how Bronte reacted when he found out Sylvanie had been injured. Is she going to be okay? She asked as Edeline rubbed a thick balm into the part of Sylvanie's wing where bits of bone poked through the skin. It's hard to tell. She'll definitely live, but she may never fly again. This is a pretty bad break. Sophie looked away as Edeline set the bone. The crunching sound made her stomach turn, but not as much as the idea of Sylvanie being grounded for the rest of life. She knew better than anyone how hard that would be for the flight-happy Alicorn. Speaking of breaks, Elwyn interrupted. Congratulations, Keith. You've cracked 4 of your ribs. First time I've ever seen that around here. Keith gave a weak smile. I'm sure I'll be proud in a few days, but for now the whole stabbing pain in my chest is killing the triumph. Elwyn handed him 4 tiny vials in all different colors. Drink those and you'll be back to causing trouble in a few hours. Wow, really? Keith poured them all into his mouth at once. That's almost too easy. He glanced guiltily at Sophie. You really can't take any? Not yet. She forced a smile, but he didn't look convinced. Neither did Elwyn, who stomped over to change her bandages. I still can't believe you willingly took Limbium, and not just a drop, an ounce. Sometimes I think you really do have a death wish, Sophie, and this, he lifted her hand and pressed gently on the needle's bruise, is downright barbaric. I don't know what this Mr. Forkel gave you, but he should be ashamed of himself. Sophie wished she could agree, but the truth was, he had no choice. It was the only way to fix me. Did it fix you? Grady interrupted, rejoining them. I don't know. I felt something change during the reaction, but it's hard to say until I try to use my abilities. Which you won't be doing for 24 hours, and don't even think about arguing, Elwyn interrupted again. If I have to leave you bruised and broken with no pain medicine, then you're not doing anything else. And when your time limit is up, I'm treating all your injuries and doing a thorough exam before you're allowed to test your abilities. Deal? I'll only agree if you do one thing, Sophie countered. Flash the light around my face like you did last time, when it went wrong. Elwyn looked leery, so she added, It's only light. I just need to know. He sighed and raised his hand. I better not regret doing this, he whispered as he clicked his fingers and a thin blue orb flashed around her face. Sophie held her breath, waiting for the pull and the pain, but nothing changed. Tears burned her eyes as she laughed and waved the light away. It didn't hurt. Even though she knew she shouldn't, she let hope swell and spread until she was filled with almost giddy warmth that dulled her aches and pains and erased her fears and worries. If that part of the problem was fixed, then maybe everything was fixed. And if everything was fixed, then maybe she could fix a few other things that were broken. Can you take me to Everglen tomorrow? She asked, hardly able to believe that in less than a day she might be able to look into Alden's bright teal eyes and have him actually see her, smile at her, talk to her. That depends. A sharp voice barked behind her, and all the warm hope burst with an icy shiver. Bronte stood at the front of the other counselors, his arms folded across his chest and a cold glint in his gray eyes. You all may be exiled.